The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul. It settled on the raw pine of the new church, on the thirsty horses tied to the hitching rail outside the saloon, and on the lace of the wedding gown that felt like a burial shroud against Clara's skin. From the small window of the hotel room, she watched the town prepare for her sacrifice. It was a boom town, bloated with the promise of silver and quick fortune. And today it celebrated the union of its richest landowner, Edwin Voss, to his third bride. Her reflection in the warped mirror was a stranger's, a pale girl with eyes as hollow and abandoned as a worked-out mine shaft. Two women, wives of her father's business associates, fussed around her, pulling the corset strings tighter until each breath was a carefully measured theft of air. "Such a fine match, Clara," one of them chirped, her voice as brittle as dried leaves. "Mr. Voss is a man of considerable standing. You are a very lucky girl." Clara said nothing. Luck felt like a story told in a language she did not understand. She thought of Edwin's previous wives. The first, a vibrant girl from back east, had died from a fall. A spirited horse, they said. The second, a quiet widow, had simply wasted away from a fever no one could name. The women of Redemption Gulch spoke of these things in whispers, their words scattering like quail whenever Edwin Voss approached. They spoke of his heavy hand and his cold rages, of the way his properties were managed with a chilling, absolute control that extended far beyond his fences and his livestock. Her father had ignored the whispers, just as he had ignored the fading yellow and purple marks on his daughter's own arms. The deal had been struck over whiskey and a handshake. Land rights for her hand. A fair trade, he had called it, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He had sold her like a plot of barren ground he no longer wished to till. The memory of his grip on her shoulder, tight and possessive, was a brand she felt even now, a constant, dull ache beneath the silk and bone of the gown. "There now," the second woman said, adjusting the veil. Its gossamer web fell over Clara's face, distorting the dusty street into a shimmering, uncertain world. A perfect bride. Through the veil, she saw him, Edwin Voss, standing on the steps of the church, a thick, solid man in a tailored black coat. He looked like a monument to his own importance. He glanced up toward her window, and even from that distance, she felt his gaze like a physical weight, a claim already staked. In that moment, something inside her, a small, resilient thing that had refused to die, broke free. It was not a thought. It was a certainty, as real as the floor beneath her feet. She would not walk to that church. She would not let his name become her new cage. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. "I need a moment," she whispered, her voice rough. "Please." The women exchanged a look, a mixture of pity and impatience, but they retreated, closing the door softly behind them. The silence that descended was absolute. For a single second, she stood frozen. Then she moved. Her fingers, clumsy and shaking, tore at the tiny pearl buttons running down the front of the gown. The delicate fabric ripped. She did not care. She pulled the heavy dress off, letting it pool on the floor like shed skin. Beneath it, she wore only a simple chemise and drawers, the underlayers of her prison. From a trunk in the corner, she pulled a worn riding skirt she had packed against her father's wishes, a foolish piece of sentiment from a life that was no longer hers. She dragged it on, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The window. It overlooked a narrow alleyway behind the hotel. It was a story and a half to the ground, too far to jump. Her eyes darted around the room. The door was the only way, but the women were just outside. Then she saw it, the adjoining door to the next room, a room that had been set aside for her father. He would be at the saloon, making one last toast to his profitable transaction. She did not hesitate. The door was unlocked. She slipped through, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. His room was empty. smelling of stale cigar smoke and whiskey. Its window opened onto the same alley, but here, a sloped roof of a woodshed was just a few feet below. She climbed out, the rough shingles scraping her legs. She landed on the shed roof with a soft thud, slid down its dusty incline, and dropped the last few feet into the filth of the alley. For a moment, she crouched behind a rain barrel, her body trembling. The sounds of the town seemed amplified, the tinny piano from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a man's loud laugh. Any second, they would discover she was gone. Any second, the hunt would begin. At the end of the alley stood the livery stable. She crept along the wall, her heart a wild bird in her chest. A stable boy was dozing on a stool in the sun. She slipped past him into the familiar scent of hay and horse. Her father's gelding was not there, but in the last stall was a powerful-looking bay, saddled and ready. It belonged to one of Edwin's men, she realized. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She took the reins, murmuring soft, useless words to the animal. It snorted, but it followed her out the back entrance of the stable, away from the main street. She did not know how to mount without a block, her skirt tangling around her legs. Panic gave her a surge of strength. She hauled herself up, clinging to the saddle horn, her bare legs gripping the horse's warm sides. She kicked it into motion, not with a gentle heel, but with a desperate, frantic drumming of her feet. The horse bolted. They burst from the alley onto a side street, and a woman carrying a basket of laundry screamed. Clara did not look back. She bent low over the horse's neck, the wind tearing the pins from her hair, and pointed it toward the only direction that offered any hope of escape, the jagged, blue-hued mountains that rose like a fortress wall against the edge of the world. She heard the first shout from the town, a cry of alarm that was quickly swallowed by the thunder of her own flight. She rode until the town was a memory, until the horse's sides were slick with sweat and its breathing was a ragged roar. The sun climbed, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. The well-worn trail dissolved into a network of game paths that snaked higher into the rocky terrain. She had no water, no food, no weapon. The thin chemise offered little protection from the sun's glare or the sharp branches that clawed at her arms and shoulders. Hours bled into one another. Thirst was a fire in her throat. Her body screamed with the unaccustomed strain of the ride. Several times, she thought she heard the sound of pursuit, the clatter of a dislodged stone, the distant whinny of a horse, and each time, a fresh wave of terror spurred her on. Pushing the bay past endurance, the land grew wilder, the canyons deeper, the air thinner and colder. She was a ghost in a tattered white chemise, fleeing through a silent, indifferent wilderness. Late in the afternoon, the horse stumbled, its leg catching in a tangle of rock and scrub. It went down hard, throwing her clear. She landed with a cry, her shoulder hitting the ground with a sickening impact. The horse struggled to its feet, its foreleg bent at an unnatural angle. It stood, trembling and broken, its dark eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. She could not bring herself to leave it, but she could not stay. Sobbing, she stroked its neck one last time and stumbled on, deeper into the mountains, on foot. Her shoes, flimsy slippers meant for a hotel room, were shredded within the first mile. The rocky ground tore at the soles of her feet, leaving a trail of blood she did not notice. The world began to swim, the edges of her vision blurring. The sun beat down. And then, as she climbed higher into the shadows of the peaks, a biting wind rose, chilling her to the bone. She was a creature of instinct now, driven by a single unwavering imperative. Away, away from the town, away from her father, away from the man who thought he owned her. She did not know how long she walked. Day bled into a twilight of hazy confusion. She was guided by the downward slope of the land, by the sound of moving water. It grew louder, a promising murmur that pulled her forward. She staggered through a thicket of willows and saw it, a creek, its water rushing clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. With a final, desperate lurch, she reached the bank and fell to her knees. Plunging her face into the icy stream, she drank until her stomach cramped, the cold a shock to her system. She tried to stand, to find shelter for the coming night, but her body had given all it had. Her legs buckled, the world tilted, the sound of the water fading to a distant hum. She collapsed into the shallows of the creek bed, the cold water swirling around her ankles, and surrendered to the encroaching darkness. James found her the next morning. He was checking his trap lines, moving through the canyons with a quiet, practiced ease that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. He saw the tracks first, the shod hoof prints of a single horse, then the smaller, bloody prints of bare human feet. Trouble. His first instinct was to turn back. Trouble was a disease he had spent 5 years trying to outrun, and this high, lonely country was his quarantine. But something, a flicker of old habit perhaps, made him follow. He found her lying half in the water, her face as white as bleached bone, her dark hair fanged out in the current. Her clothes, a ridiculous combination of a fine lady's undergarment and a dirty riding skirt, were torn to shreds. She looked like a broken doll discarded by a careless child. He stood over her for a long moment, his face hard and unreadable. He saw the raw, blistered skin of her feet, the deep scratches on her arms, the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone. This was not a woman who had simply gotten lost on a ride. This was a woman who had run from something terrible. He knelt, his calloused fingers pressing against the side of her neck, a pulse, faint and thready. But there, he cursed under his breath. It would be an act of mercy to leave her. The mountains would claim her, and whatever trouble she was running from would die with her. His life was simple here. It was hard, but it was his. He answered to no one. He wanted nothing from the world below, and he wanted it to want nothing from him. A woman like this was a complication he could not afford. She was a link to a life he had burned to the ground. And yet, he looked at her face, slack with delirium, and saw not a lady, but a fighter. To have made it this far, in this condition, took a will of iron. He saw the fierce set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. Reluctantly, with a grim sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his past regrets, he slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile collection of skin and bone. He lifted her easily, her head lolling against his shoulder, and began the long, slow trek back to the hidden shack he called home. His cabin was little more than a single room built into the side of a box canyon, almost invisible from a distance. He laid her on his own narrow cot, the rough wool blanket a stark contrast to her pale skin. He built up the fire in the stone hearth, his movements efficient and stripped of any wasted motion. He filled a kettle with water from a barrel and set it to heat. He had learned medicine in a far uglier place than this, and his hands, though rough, were surprisingly gentle as he worked. He cut away the remnants of her chemise, his expression unchanging as he cleaned the cuts and scratches that covered her body. He wrapped her blistered feet in clean rags soaked in a poultice of herbs. Through it all, she did not stir, lost in a fever that made her murmur broken, senseless words. He covered her with a blanket, sat down in the single wooden chair he owned, and began to clean his rifle, his eyes never leaving the still form on the cot. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and the alien feeling of coarse wool against her skin. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud. A fire crackled in a hearth across the small room, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog in her mind. This was not the wilderness. This was a room, a trap. She tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. A man sat in a chair near the fire, his back to her. He was large, his shoulders broad under a faded flannel shirt. At her movement, he turned his head. His face was all angles and shadows in the firelight. framed by dark, shaggy hair and a rough beard. But it was his eyes that seized her. They were a startlingly pale gray, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness, like a hawk watches its prey. He was a stranger, a man, and every instinct she had screamed that a strange man in a remote place meant danger. A choked cry escaped her lips. She scrambled backward on the cot, trying to put distance between them, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She thought of Edwin, of her father. She would not be taken again. She would not be broken. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. The man did not move. He simply watched her, his expression giving nothing away. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "Easy now." His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. But she was beyond reason. She lunged off the cot, her bare feet screaming in protest as they hit the cold dirt floor. She grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy iron poker from the hearth, and brandished it between them, her arms trembling with a mixture of weakness and adrenaline. "I will not let you hurt me," she said, the words a desperate vow. The man slowly rose to his feet. He was taller than she had realized, a formidable presence in the small, fire-lit cabin. He took a single, slow step toward her. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice even. "You need water, and you need to lie back down before you fall down." "Liar," she hissed, backing away until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the wall. She was cornered. The poker felt impossibly heavy. He kept coming, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was not afraid of her, and that terrified her more than anything. When he was just out of reach, he stopped. He looked at the poker, then back at her face. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes besides cold vigilance. It was not pity. It was something closer to understanding, a bleak acknowledgement that twisted her insides. He held his ground, and for a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and her own ragged breathing. Finally, the strength drained from her arms. The poker clattered to the floor. Her body began to shake uncontrollably, a storm of delayed shock and terror. She slid down the wall and curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around her head, waiting for the blow that she knew must come. It never did. After a moment, she felt him place something beside her on the floor. She risked a glance. It was a tin cup of water. He had retreated to the other side of the cabin and was adding another log to the fire, his back to her once more. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply let her be. Slowly, shakily, she reached for the cup and drank. The water was cold and clean. He had given her water. He had tended her wounds. She could feel the clean bandages on her feet now. But he remained a mystery, a threat she could not measure. Over the next day, they existed in a state of strained silence. He offered her food, a thin broth, a piece of hard bread, which she ate without a word. He would leave for hours at a time, disappearing into the canyons, and return with a rabbit or a brace of quail. She would watch him from the cot, her fears slowly giving way to a wary curiosity. He moved with a purpose that wasted nothing. One afternoon, he chopped wood just outside the open cabin door. He had taken off his shirt in the afternoon heat, and as he swung the axe, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released, and she saw them. Scars, a web of old, white lines that crisscrossed his torso. One, a puckered, ugly mark high on his shoulder, looked like it had come from a bullet. Another, a long, thin slash across his ribs, was surely from a knife. These were not the marks of a simple rancher or a prospector. These were the marks of a man who had known violence intimately. He must have felt her gaze. He stopped, the axe resting on the chopping block, and turned his head slightly. His gray eyes met hers. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the pain that marked them both, inside and out. He held her gaze for a long second, his face unreadable, before turning back to his work without a word. That night, the cold of the high country seeped through the walls of the cabin. The fire was a small island of warmth in the vast, dark silence. He sat in his chair, oiling the action of his rifle. She sat on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in the wool blanket. She had not spoken more than a handful of words to him, had not told him her name or where she came from. He had not asked. But the silence, the safety, the warmth, it broke down the walls she had so carefully constructed. The terror of her escape, the agony of her journey, the years of quiet suffering that had come before it all. It rose up in her like a tide. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. Soon, her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. She pressed her fist to her mouth, trying to stifle the sound, ashamed of her own weakness. But the grief was too big. A broken, hiccuping sound escaped her. She buried her face in the rough blanket and finally let go, crying for the girl she had been, for the woman she had never been allowed to become, for the utter, desolate loneliness of her existence. The sobs racked her small frame, raw and agonizing sounds in the quiet of the cabin. Across the room, the man, James, stopped his work. He did not move. He did not speak. He sat in the shadows, listening to the sound of a soul breaking apart. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing a deep, unutterable sadness in his own eyes, a stillness heavy with the ghosts of his own memories. He just listened, his silence a strange and unexpected courtesy, a shared vigil in the vast, uncaring darkness of the mountains. The day after her storm of tears, a fragile truce settled over the cabin. The silence was different now, less a wall of suspicion and more a shared space, weighted with things unsaid. James moved about his morning rituals, checking the snares, splitting kindling with the same gruff economy of motion, but he would leave a piece of dried meat on the small table for her without a word, an offering that felt like an apology. Clara, in turn, found a needle and thread in his sparse belongings and began meticulously mending the tears in his flannel shirt, her small stitches an attempt to repair more than just the fabric. Finally, as she sat by the fire, her hands busy with their task, he spoke, his voice low and rough, startled her. "Who are you running from?" He did not look at her, his attention seemingly fixed on sharpening a skinning knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was the only other sound. Clara's fingers stilled. She stared into the flames, the name Edwin Voss a poison on her tongue. To speak it felt like a conjuring, an invitation for that darkness to find her here in this small, quiet place. "A man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A man who was to be my husband." The scraping stopped. He waited. She chose her words carefully, pulling them from the bruised corners of her memory. "He is a collector of things. He likes his things perfect, kept in their place." She drew a shuddering breath, the phantom pressure of a corset tightening around her ribs. "He has a fine house with strong locks. For safety. He said I was clumsy, always bruising myself on door frames and furniture." She did not need to say more. She felt his gaze on her now, sharp and penetrating. She looked up and met his eyes, letting him see the truth there, the ghost of fear she knew he recognized. He grunted, a sound of grim understanding, and returned to his knife. After a long silence, he spoke again, his own confession offered like a piece of flint, hard and chipped. "Used to wear a badge myself," he said, the words clipped. "In a different life," he paused, his thumb testing the blade's edge. "Before I learned a star is just a piece of tin men use to get what they want." He did not elaborate, and the finality in his tone forbade any questions. He wanted nothing to do with law or the men who claimed to uphold it. He believed in his rifle, his knife, and the unforgiving justice of the mountains. The world of men, with its rules and its corruption, was a disease for which this isolation was the only cure. A week passed. Clara's feet began to heal, the raw blisters turning to hardened skin. The terror in her eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful calm. James gave her a pair of his old boots, which were far too large, but which she stuffed with rags and wore with a gratitude that was a silent, aching thing between them. He never touched her, never offered a word of comfort, but in his own way, he was a steady presence. He made sure she ate. He kept the fire going through the cold nights. He stood between her and the vast, hungry wilderness. But their fragile peace could not last. Supplies were running low. James announced one morning that he had to ride to the nearest settlement, a mining camp called Jasper's Fork, a 2-day journey away. He looked at her, his expression grim. "Stay inside. Don't build the fire up too much. Don't go wandering." The thought of being left alone sent a spike of fear through her, but she nodded, understanding the necessity. She watched him ride away on his sturdy buckskin horse, a lone figure swallowed by the immense landscape, and the cabin suddenly felt terribly empty and vulnerable. Jasper's Fork was a collection of tents and crude shacks clinging to a mountainside, smelling of unwashed men, cheap whiskey, and blasted rock. James kept his head down, trading his furs for flour, salt, and coffee at the general store. He ignored the speculative glances of the miners and the painted smiles of the saloon girls. He wanted only to conclude his business and be gone. It was on the wall of the assayer's office that he saw it, a piece of paper, freshly nailed to the rough plank wall. A wanted poster, but it was not a man's face that stared out from the crude drawing. It was a woman's. The likeness was poor, but the description was unmistakable. Wanted, information leading to the safe return of Miss Clara Abernathy. Fair of face, dark hair, last seen wearing a white dress, believed to have been kidnapped by a dangerous and armed outlaw. She is the intended bride of Mr. Edwin Voss of Redemption Gulch, who offers this reward out of deep concern for her welfare, $500. James's blood ran cold. $500. It was more money than most of the men in this camp would see in a year. It was enough to turn a decent man into a predator. And there were precious few decent men in Jasper's Fork. Kidnapped. The word was a calculated lie, a piece of branding that turned her from a victim into his accomplice, and him from a reluctant savior into a criminal. Edwin Voss. The name sounded as solid and unyielding as a bank vault. He turned away, his face a mask of stone, and finished his purchases. The ride back was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant rider was a potential bounty hunter. The woman in his cabin was no longer just a complication. She was a death sentence. He could leave her. He could pack his things, ride west, and never look back. It was the smart thing to do, the only logical choice. She had brought this trouble to his door, a trouble he had forsaken the world to avoid. He owed her nothing. He had found her, healed her. That was enough. He hardened his heart against the image of her, mending his shirt by the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration. He tried to forget the sound of her weeping in the dark. He rode into the canyon late the next day, his mind still a battlefield. He saw the thin trail of smoke from the cabin's chimney and felt a strange knot of feeling in his chest. Part dread, part something else. Relief. As he dismounted, he noticed it. A fresh set of hoofprints, not his own, leading toward the cabin, and a bay horse, a fine animal, tied to a tree just out of sight. His hand went instantly to the pistol on his hip. He moved toward the cabin, silent as a wolf, his body low to the ground. He crept to the single and grimy window and looked inside. Clara was standing by the hearth, her back to the wall, her face a mask of terror. A man stood in the center of the room, a greasy, self-satisfied smile on his face. He was lanky and wore a dusty duster, a pistol holstered low on his hip. He held the wanted poster in one hand, tapping it with a grimy finger. $500 is a lot of money, little lady, the man was saying, his voice oozing confidence. Mr. Voss will be mighty pleased to have you back. And your kidnapper, well, the poster says he's dangerous. I expect there's another reward for him, dead or alive." He took a step toward her. "Now, you just tell old Finn where he is, and I'll make sure to put in a good word for you." James did not wait to hear more. He burst through the door, a blur of motion. Finn spun around, his hand flying to his gun, but he was too slow. James was not interested in a fair fight. He crashed into the bounty hunter, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The cabin exploded into a chaos of grunts, curses, and the thud of bodies hitting wood. Clara screamed, scrambling back against the wall. This was not a gunfight from a dime novel. It was a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. Finn was wiry and strong, fighting with the feral tenacity of a cornered weasel. He managed to get his pistol out, but James slammed the man's wrist against the floorboards again and again until the gun skittered away into a corner. Finn's hand snaked to his belt and came away with a long, wicked-looking knife. He slashed upward, and James twisted away with a grunt of pain as the blade sliced through his sleeve and bit into the flesh of his forearm. The sight of his own blood seemed to unleash something primal in James. His face, which Clara had only ever seen as a mask of stoic control, was now a terrifying visage of cold, lethal fury. He drove his elbow into Finn's throat, and the man gagged, his eyes bulging. James grabbed the man's knife hand, and for a terrible moment, the two men were locked in a stalemate, muscles straining, sweat beading on their foreheads. Then, with a roar that seemed torn from the very depths of his soul, James forced the knife back, turning the point toward Finn's own chest. The bounty hunter's eyes widened in disbelief and terror. He tried to writhe away, but James's weight was on him, a crushing, unmovable force. The knife went in with a sickening, wet sound. Finn's body arched in a silent scream, and then he went limp. For a long moment, James remained on top of the dead man, his chest heaving, blood from his arm dripping onto the floor. The silence that fell was more shocking than the violence itself. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He stood over the body, his expression dazed, as if he were waking from a terrible dream. Clara stared, her knuckles pressed to her mouth, her mind unable to process what she had just seen. She had seen her father's casual cruelty, had feared Edwin's cold-blooded control, but she had never witnessed violence like this. It was swift, efficient, and utterly final. The man on the floor was not a person anymore. He was just a thing. And James, the quiet, scarred man who had shown her a sliver of kindness, had done it. He was a killer. She was horrified, and, to her shame, she was awed. This was the reality of the world she had fled into, a world where life was cheap and survival was a bloody, hands-on business. James finally looked at her, his gray eyes haunted. He saw the fear and the shock on her face, and something inside him seemed to break. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It was not a question. It was a demand. He slumped into the chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a man who looked ancient and weary. He stared at his hands, one of which was still smeared with Finn's blood. "I fought in the war," he said, his voice flat and empty. "Fought for the Union, fought for justice and a better world. All the pretty lies they tell you to get you to kill other men." He finally looked up, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made her ache. "I came home to find my fiancée, Eleanor, had been hanged." The words fell into the silent room like stones. "The town sheriff," he continued, his voice thick with a hatred that was still fresh after all these years. "He wanted her. She wouldn't have him. So he found a reason, claimed she stole a locket from the mercantile. He was the judge, the jury, and the hangman, all nice and legal, all under the color of that star he wore on his chest." He took a deep, ragged breath. "I killed him. And then I came up here. I wanted no more part of their laws or their justice. He had taken a life to avenge a life, and just now, he had taken another to save hers. The chasm between them suddenly closed. She saw him then, not as a killer, but as a man shattered by a world that had taken everything from him. She saw the scars on his soul, and they matched her own. She walked slowly toward him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She knelt before his chair. "I never felt alive," she said, her voice soft but fierce, a confession of her own. "Not once. Every breath I took in that house was a poison. I was a doll on a shelf. The moment I climbed out that window, the moment the wind hit my face, that was the first time I ever felt alive." Her words seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He looked down at her, at the fierce, desperate life shining in her eyes. His hands, which had just dealt death, rose slowly. They trembled as he cupped her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His touch was not rough. It was tentative, reverent, as if he were holding something impossibly fragile. The air crackled between them, thick with shared pain and a startling, unfamiliar heat. For a heartbeat. She thought he would kiss her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Then, with a choked sound, he pulled his hands away as if he had been burned. He stood up abruptly and walked to the other side of the cabin, turning his back on her, his entire body rigid with a conflict she could not begin to understand. They could not stay. They wrapped the bounty hunter's body in his own bedroll and left him in the cabin. James said the wolves would take care of him. They took what little they could carry and hiked for hours, deeper into the mountains, until they came to an abandoned mine shack tucked into a narrow, windswept ravine. It was smaller than the cabin, little more than a single room with a rusted-out stove and a leaky roof. It was a desperate place, a hole in the earth, but it was hidden. As they settled in for the first night, the wind began to howl, and a fine, thin snow began to fall. By morning, it was a blizzard. A wall of white fury descended on the mountains, erasing the world, trapping them in the cramped, cold shack. The days that followed were a blur of gray light and the constant, shrieking moan of the wind. They were forced into a proximity that was almost unbearable. They moved around each other in the tiny space, their arms brushing, their bodies sharing the same small circle of warmth from the sputtering stove. The tension that had sparked in the cabin now had nowhere to go. It simmered in the charged silence, in the long, stolen glances, in the way he would watch her as she slept, in the way she found her eyes drawn, again and again, to the shape of his hands. The world had been reduced to this single room, to two people and the dangerous, unspoken thing that was growing between them. One night, the storm raged with a particular fury, rattling the shack's flimsy door. They sat huddled together under the single wool blanket, sharing its meager warmth. In the flickering light of a candle, she saw the long, thin scar across his ribs, a pale line against his skin where his shirt had gaped open. She did not think. She acted. Her fingers, tentative and trembling, reached out and traced the raised line of the scar. His entire body went rigid. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist in a grip of iron. It was not a violent gesture, but it was absolute, a desperate, instinctual act of self-defense. His gray eyes, wild and dark in the candlelight, locked onto hers. He was fighting a war inside himself. She could see it. He was fighting his own ghosts, his own pain, his own burgeoning desire. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She did not pull away. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a silent, pleading question. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. His grip tightened, and then, with a shudder that seemed to rack his entire frame, he let her go. His hand fell away, and he sat there, trembling in the cold, charged air of the storm. The silence that followed his trembling retreat was heavier than the weight of the snow that pressed in on the tiny shack. For days, The storm was their jailer. It built a world of white, smothering sound, erasing the mountains, the sky, and any path that might lead away. They were trapped in a cocoon of shivering quiet. The world shrunk to the space of a few feet, the air thick with the thing that had been unleashed between them. They spoke little, but every glance was a conversation. Every accidental brush of his hand against hers as they reached for the same piece of firewood was a jolt of lightning. The desire was a living creature in the room with them, a starving wolf pacing the perimeter of their restraint. Clara felt it as a hollow ache deep in her bones, a desperate, painful longing for a life she had only ever glimpsed in forbidden dreams. It was a hunger not just for his touch, but for the very idea of being touched without fear, of being wanted for herself and not as a possession. For James. It was a ghost he fought in the long, dark hours of the night. In her, he saw not just a woman in need of protection, but a reflection of his own brokenness, a spirit as fiercely determined to survive as his own. To touch her felt like a betrayal of the woman he had lost, and yet, to deny the pull toward her felt like a betrayal of the man he still was, the man who could still feel something other than rage and grief. The end came on the fourth night of the storm. The wind had died to a low moan, and the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, each one a whisper against the roof. The stove had burned low, and a deep, penetrating cold had crept into the shack. They were huddled under the same blanket, not touching, but the warmth of his body just inches from hers was a torment. She could not bear the silence any longer. She turned to him, the movement small and hesitant in the near darkness. The candle stub on the crate between them threw his face into a stark landscape of shadow and light. "What are you so afraid of?" she whispered, her voice a small, brave sound in the immense quiet. His gaze, when it met hers, was bleak. "Myself," he answered, his voice rough with an honesty that scraped her soul. "I'm afraid of what's in me, the part that broke that man in the cabin, the part that knows how to hurt." She saw it then, the terrible weight he carried. He saw himself as a weapon, a thing of violence, and he was terrified of turning that violence on her, of becoming another man who used his strength to cause pain. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid, coiled like a rope pulled taut. "You are not him," she said, her voice low and steady. "You are not my father. You are not Edwin Voss. I have seen what they are. I am not afraid of you." Her words were a key turning a lock deep inside him. A shudder went through his body, a release of some long-held tension. He looked at her, at the absolute conviction in her eyes, and the last of his defenses crumbled. He moved, not with hesitation, but with a sudden, desperate finality, as if a dam had broken. His hands came up to frame her face, his calloused fingers sinking into her hair. He pulled her toward him, and his mouth found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two solitudes, a desperate, hungry claiming. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and a loneliness so profound it stole her breath. She did not pull back. She met his raw need with her own, her hands clutching at his shirt, pulling him closer. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his mouth never leaving hers, and pressed her back against the rough, cold wood of the shack's wall. The shock of the cold against her thin chemise made her gasp, but the sound was lost against his lips. His body was a wall of heat against hers, hard and demanding. She felt the frantic beat of his heart against her own, a wild, galloping rhythm that was the only music in the world. This was it. This was the life she had ached for, the feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly present in her own skin. Her body, which had only ever known the cold calculation of a transaction or the sharp agony of a blow, was suddenly on fire. The encounter was a storm to match the one outside. It was raw and unpracticed, charged with all the longing and grief and fear they had held inside for so long. It was the desperate act of two people who were not sure if they would live to see another season, seeking an anchor in the whirlwind. There was tenderness in the way his hands traced the lines of her face, and there was a deep, aching regret in his eyes even as he lost himself in her. For Clara, it was a reclamation. Every touch was a defiance of her past, every sensation a victory over the numbness that had been her shield. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the thin blanket, the candle guttering in its last moments. The shack was silent save for the sound of their breathing. The air was thick with what had passed between them. James moved first, pulling away from her slowly, putting a space between their bodies that felt like a chasm. He sat up, his back to her, his broad shoulders slumped. "I shouldn't have," he said, his voice a low rasp of self-loathing. "Clara, I'm sorry. You were hurt and you were scared, and I took advantage." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at his back, at the rigid line of his spine, and for the first time since she had fled Redemption Gulch, she felt not a flicker of fear, only a strange, fierce strength. "Look at me, James," she commanded. He flinched at the authority in her voice, but after a moment, he turned. His face was a mask of guilt. "You did not take anything," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a tremor of her old fear. "It was the first thing I have ever truly chosen for myself." He stared at her, truly seeing her then, not as a fragile thing to be protected, but as a woman of formidable will. He saw the fire in her eyes, the fire he had glimpsed when he first found her, now burning bright and clear. The guilt on his face did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, a profound and humbling awe. When the snow finally lifted, it was as if the world had been reborn, washed clean and sparkling under a sharp winter sun. The tension between them had changed. The desperate, simmering desire had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intimacy. They were bound together now, not just by circumstance, but by a shared act of defiance. Their life fell into a new rhythm. The threat was still out there, a shadow on the horizon, but in the small, sunlit world of their ravine, they carved out a fragile peace. James began to teach her how to survive. He showed her how to set a snare, how to track a deer, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, and he taught her how to shoot. He placed his heavy Colt revolver in her hand. It was shockingly heavy, a cold, dense piece of metal. "A gun ain't a toy," he said, his voice serious. "You don't point it at anything you don't mean to kill. You respect it, but you don't fear it. It's a tool, and out here, it's the only law that matters." His hands covered hers, showing her how to hold it, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights on a distant pine cone. His touch was impersonal, the touch of a teacher, but she was acutely aware of his closeness, of the warmth of his breath on her neck. When she finally pulled the trigger, the sound was a deafening crack that echoed through the canyon. The kick of it jolted her arm, but the pine cone exploded in a shower of woody fragments. A fierce, wild thrill shot through her. It was a feeling of power, of agency. She was no longer just a creature who ran. She was a creature who could fight back. Her confidence grew with every shot she fired, with every task she mastered. They hunted together, moving in a quiet, practiced synchronicity. They shared their meals by the fire, the silence between them now comfortable, punctuated by slow smiles and quiet glances. He never spoke of his past again, and she did not ask. She knew his ghosts were still with him, just as hers were with her. But in this small, temporary life they had built, the ghosts seemed to keep a respectful distance, but the world below had not forgotten them. In Redemption Gulch, Edwin Voss was a man consumed by a cold, methodical rage. It was not love that drove him, or even desire. It was the fury of a proprietor whose property had been stolen. Clara was his, bought and paid for, and the idea that she had defied him, that she had chosen the wilderness over the gilded cage he offered, was an insult he could not abide. He sat in the smoky confines of the town saloon, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. Across the table sat Sheriff Miller, a man whose loyalty was as pliable as the cheap tin of his badge. "She can't have just vanished. Miller," Voss said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Someone saw something. Someone always sees something. I want you to squeeze this town until it tells us where she went." "We've asked everyone. Edwin," the sheriff whined, wiping his sweaty upper lip with the back of his hand. "No one's seen a thing since she rode out." "Then ask them again," Voss said, his eyes like chips of flint. "Remind them that my goodwill is what keeps this town prosperous, and remind them that there is a $500 reward. For that kind of money, a man might suddenly remember something he forgot." For days, Sheriff Miller and two of Voss's hired men went from door to door, their questions becoming less like inquiries and more like threats. They interrogated merchants, blacksmiths, and stable hands. They rousted drunkards and leaned on prospectors. They found nothing. Finally, they came to the small shack at the edge of town where an old woman named Martha lived. She had been a midwife once, and her eyes had seen more of life and death than most. "A runaway bride?" she said, her voice a dry crackle. I saw her, just for a second. As she rode past, the horse was in a lather." The sheriff leaned in, his expression eager. "Which way did she go? Did you see the man who took her?" The old woman shook her head slowly. "There was no man. She was alone, and she wasn't being taken. She was fleeing. I know that look. I've seen it on 100 faces." She paused, her gaze turning inward. "It was her eyes I remember. Not frightened like a rabbit, frightened like a cornered doe that knows it has to fight or die." She looked up at the mountains, a jagged line against the blue sky. "She went that way, into the high country. Only a fool or someone truly desperate goes into the canyons before the first snow." Back in the mine shack, Clara knew nothing of the net that was slowly being drawn, but her past was not so easily escaped. One night, she was jolted from sleep by a terrible, vivid dream. She was back in her father's house, in her room. Edwin was there, his face a mask of cold fury. He was not shouting. He never shouted. He was unbuckling his belt, the thick leather making a soft, sinister sound. He was telling her, in his calm, reasonable voice, that she needed to be taught a lesson about obedience. She woke with a scream caught in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat, shaking violently. The terror was so real, so immediate, that for a moment she thought she was there. James was awake instantly. He moved to her side in the darkness, and before she could flinch away, his arms were around her. "You're here," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "You're safe. It was just a dream." She buried her face in his chest, her body racked with tremors. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask her what she had dreamed. He just held her, his solid presence a bulwark against the phantoms that haunted her. He did not speak again, but he did not let go. He held her until the shaking subsided, until her breathing evened out, until the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shack's wall. A few days later, she was sitting outside, cleaning the rifle, when he came and sat beside her. He said nothing, simply held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, intricately carved object. It was a hair comb, fashioned from the white, smooth bone of a deer's antler. He had carved it with delicate, swirling patterns, polishing it until it shone. She stared at it, her throat tightening. It was a simple thing, a beautiful thing. It was a thing of no practical value for survival. It was just for her. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. She took the comb from his hand, its surface cool and smooth against her skin, and she began to cry, not with the racking sobs of grief or terror, but with quiet, streaming tears of a feeling so new and overwhelming she did not have a name for it. It was the first gift she had ever been given that did not come with a price. It was not a bribe for her affection or a down payment on her obedience. It was just a gift, given freely, a small piece of beauty, created just for her, in the middle of an ugly, dangerous world. The fragile piece of the high ravine could not hold against the turning of the seasons. As the last of the snow melted, leaving the earth damp and smelling of pine, a new kind of restlessness settled in. The mountains, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every snapped twig, every distant cry of a hawk, sent a jolt of anxiety through Clara. The bounty hunter, Finn, would not be the last. Edwin Voss was not a man who gave up what he considered his. "He will not stop," she said one evening, her voice quiet as she stared into the flames of their small campfire. "As long as we are in this territory, he will hunt us." James looked at her, his face grim in the firelight. He knew she was right. They were living on borrowed time. "West," he said, the single word a decision. "Colorado, a man can disappear there. Start fresh." The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. A new place, a new name, a life not defined by what she had fled. It felt like an impossible dream. But looking at James, at the steady resolve in his gray eyes, she allowed a flicker of hope to take root in the barren ground of her heart. They spent the next few days preparing. They had the bounty hunter's horse now, a strong bay that would carry their meager supplies. James hunted, smoking the meat into jerky. Clara patched their clothes and packed what little they had. As she was cinching the straps on her saddlebag, the one from the horse she had stolen from Redemption Gulch, her fingers brushed against a pocket she had forgotten. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was her wedding veil. She pulled it out. It was a fine, delicate thing of lace and silk, a spider's web meant to trap her. She remembered the women fussing with it, the way it had blurred the world, turning her last view of freedom into a shimmering haze. It was a relic from a dead life, a ghost she had carried with her unknowingly. That night, without a word to James, she walked to the edge of the fire. He watched her, his expression questioning, as she held the veil over the flames. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she let it go. The delicate fabric caught instantly, turning from white to a sickly brown before erupting into a brief, bright flower of orange flame. It twisted and writhed, the intricate lace patterns turning to black, crumbling into nothing. She watched until the last of it was ash, a dark smudge on the glowing embers. When she turned back to James, her face was calm and set. She had performed the final rites for the woman she was supposed to have been. They set out at dawn, two small figures moving against a vast, indifferent landscape. They rode hard, keeping to the high, broken country, avoiding trails and clearings. James moved with a hunter's instinct, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his body attuned to the silent language of the wilderness. Clara rode beside him, no longer a terrified passenger but an active participant. She had learned. She watched the way he used the terrain for cover, the way he paused to listen, the way he studied the ground for signs. They had been on the trail for 3 days when their luck ran out. They were navigating a narrow pass, a bottleneck of crumbling rock and stunted pine. When the first shot rang out, the sound was a sharp, flat crack that echoed off the canyon walls, and it was followed by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off the rock just inches from Clara's head. Their horses reared in terror. James cursed, his hand flying to the rifle in its scabbard. "Get down!" he yelled, shoving her from her saddle. She tumbled to the ground as another shot kicked up a spray of dirt where she had just been. 2 riders appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the sky. They were too far to see clearly, but their intent was unmistakable. James fired his rifle, the shot a booming answer to theirs, and one of the figures ducked back behind the rocks. "Go!" James shouted, grabbing the reins of her horse. "Ride! Use the rocks for cover!" But as he turned to mount his own horse, a third shot rang out. James cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered, his hand clutching his shoulder. A dark stain blossomed on his shirt. Fear, cold and absolute, seized Clara. For a heartbeat, she was frozen. The terrified girl from the hotel room once more. Then she saw the look on his face, not fear, but a grim, furious determination. And she saw the blood, his blood, dark and real upon the dusty ground. Something inside her snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it was shoved aside by a fierce, protective rage. She remembered what he had taught her. The terrain. Evasion. She grabbed the reins of his horse and shoved him toward it. "Get on!" she screamed, her voice raw. He swayed, his face pale, but he managed to haul himself into the saddle. She scrambled onto her own mount, bent low over the horse's neck just as he had shown her, and kicked it into a gallop. They plunged down the far side of the pass, bullets whining around them. She did not ride blindly. Her eyes, wide with adrenaline, scanned the landscape ahead. A dry creek bed, a thick stand of aspen. She veered toward the creek bed, its high, rocky banks offering some protection. They raced along its winding course, the sound of their horses' hooves a frantic thunder. The pursuit seemed to fall back. The narrow, twisting path made for a difficult chase. For an hour, they rode without stopping, pushing the horses until their sides were heaving and lathered with sweat. Finally, when she was sure they were not being followed, she slowed them to a walk. James was slumped in his saddle, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. "We need to hide," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Find water." He nodded weakly, his eyes clouded with pain. Following a barely there game trail, she led them deeper into a maze of canyons until she found what she was looking for, a dark opening in a rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of ancient, gnarled junipers. A cave. She helped him dismount, his full weight slumping against her. She half-dragged him into the cool darkness of the cave. It was not deep, but it was dry and sheltered. She eased him to the ground, his back against the rock wall. In the dim light, the wound was worse than she had feared. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, leaving a ragged exit wound. It was bleeding sluggishly, the fabric of his shirt already stiffening with it. "The fire," he grunted, his teeth clenched. "Need to heat a knife?" She knew what he meant. The wound had to be cauterized to stop the bleeding and fight infection. She worked with a desperate efficiency, gathering dry twigs and branches, using the flint and steel from his saddlebag to coax a small, smokeless fire to life just inside the cave's entrance. She took his knife and laid the blade in the heart of the flames until it glowed a dull red. While it heated, she took her own knife, the small skinning knife he had given her, and tore a long strip from the hem of her chemise. She found his whiskey flask and poured some of the raw, burning liquid onto the cloth. When she turned back to him, his face was slick with sweat, but his eyes were clear and fixed on her. "This will hurt," she whispered. "Get on with it," he ground out. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the wound, her stomach churning at the sight of the torn flesh. He did not make a sound, but his entire body was rigid, a statue of pure, controlled agony. Then she took the glowing knife from the fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the small cave, a sickening, acrid scent. He let out a long, shuddering hiss of air through his teeth, but he did not cry out. When it was done, she used another strip of her chemise to bind the wound, her movements clumsy but firm. His pain was a palpable thing in the air between them, a raw, living entity. She knelt before him, her work finished, her body shaking with the aftershocks of terror and exertion. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with pain and something else, something that looked like gratitude. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, not like the one in the shack. It was not meant to comfort him. It was a desperate act of affirmation. She kissed him to feel the solid, living warmth of him, to anchor herself against the terrifying realization of how close she had come to losing him. It was a kiss that said, "You are alive. I am alive. "We are still here." He did not have the strength to respond, but his hand came up and rested weakly on the back of her neck before falling away. They stayed in the cave for 2 days, but they both knew their pursuers would not give up. Edwin's men were not simple bounty hunters. They were hounds, and Voss was a relentless master. They heard them once, the distant sound of riders passing through the canyon below, their voices carrying on the thin air. The news came from a lone prospector they stumbled upon, a man with haunted eyes and a story that turned Clara's blood to ice. Edwin's men had swept through the foothills, spreading their poison. They were telling the homesteaders that a violent outlaw named James had kidnapped Edwin Voss's innocent, virgin bride. They offered money for information and made threats to those who might offer shelter. And they had started to burn things. "A family down on Clear Creek," the prospectors said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "The Millers wouldn't say if they'd seen you. So Voss's men torched their barn, said it was a warning. The fire spread to the house. Martha Miller and her boy. They didn't get out." The world tilted. A mother and a child, dead, in a fire that was meant as a message for her. Clara stumbled away from the prospector's campfire, her hand pressed to her mouth, a wave of nausea and horror washing over her. She fell to her knees and was sick, the bitter taste of bile in her throat. She was responsible. Her flight, her defiance, it had brought this down on innocent people. The weight of it was crushing, a physical burden that bent her spine. She sat there in the dirt, rocking back and forth, the prospector's words echoing in her mind. They didn't get out. James found her there, his face etched with concern. He knelt beside her, his good arm resting on her shoulder. "This is my fault," she choked out, the words torn from her. "All of this, that woman, her little boy, they're dead because of me." He gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging in slightly, forcing her to look at him. "No," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Their blood is not on your hands, it's on his. This is what men like him do. Clara, they burn whatever stands in their way. He would have found a reason to hurt those people with or without you. Cruelty is his nature. Blood was always his answer, not yours." His words were a shield against the crushing guilt, but the wound was too deep. The image of a burning house, of a mother and her child trapped inside, would be seared into her memory forever. James's own condition was worsening. The wound, which had seemed clean at first, was now inflamed, the edges an angry red. A fever was taking hold. By nightfall, he was shivering uncontrollably, his skin hot to the touch. He grew weaker, his movements sluggish, his mind clouded. The role reversal was complete. He was now the one who was helpless, and their survival rested entirely on her shoulders. She forced him to drink water, to eat the broth she made from a squirrel she managed to kill with a well-aimed rock. She tended his wound, changing the dressing, her heart sinking as she saw the infection spreading. She hunted, armed with the heavy Colt. She ventured out from their hiding places, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, and brought back rabbits and grouse. She learned to skin them quickly, her hands becoming steady and practiced. She was no longer Clara Abernathy, the would-be bride. She was a creature of the wilderness, a hunter, a survivor. She would return to find James lost in a fevered haze. He seemed to be reliving the war, muttering about mud and cannons and the faces of dead friends. Once, she came back to the cave to find him sitting up, staring at the rock wall, silent tears streaming down his face. He did not seem to know she was there. She said nothing, her own heart aching with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical wound. She simply wiped his face with a damp cloth and sat with him until the spell passed. The worst was when he spoke his fiancée's name. In his delirium, he would reach out a trembling hand into the empty air and whisper it. Eleanor. The name was a soft, broken sound, a prayer to a ghost. Each time he said it, a shard of ice pierced Clara's heart. She was tending the wounds of a man whose soul was still bound to another. A bitter, unfamiliar jealousy mingled with her sorrow. She was a placeholder, a temporary comfort, a means of survival. The gentle intimacy they had shared, the fragile hope she had harbored, it all seemed like a foolish fantasy now. One night, the fever was at its peak. He was thrashing on their makeshift bed of pine boughs, his body slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged. She bathed his face with cool water, trying to soothe the fire that was consuming him. He was burning up from the inside out. She was afraid he would not last until morning. She did not know what else to do. She lay down beside him on the pine boughs, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak. She put her arm over his chest, willing her own strength, her own life, into him. He was still muttering, lost in his world of ghosts and pain. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, her own whispered words a promise, a plea, and a defiant stand against the darkness that threatened to take him. "You're not alone anymore." The fever broke like a thunderstorm in the dead of night. One moment, James was a burning, thrashing weight beside her. The next, a profound stillness fell over him. The violent shivers ceased, and the heat began to recede from his skin, leaving behind a clammy dampness. Clara, who had been dozing fitfully with her head on his good shoulder, woke instantly. In the pale moonlight filtering into the cave, she saw that his eyes were open, and for the first time in days, they were clear. They were watching her. His recovery was a slow, arduous crawl back to the world of the living. The infection lingered, a stubborn poison that left him weak and drained. But the fever was gone, and with its departure, the ghosts that had haunted his delirium seemed to retreat. He was quiet, his natural stoicism amplified by his physical depletion. He would watch her for long stretches as she moved about their small camp, his expression unreadable. He watched her skin a rabbit with practiced hands, watched her check the perimeter for tracks, watched her clean the revolver with a steady, focused calm. He was seeing the woman she had become in the crucible of his illness. One evening, as a bruised purple twilight settled over the canyons, they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them. He had been quiet all day, but it was a different kind of quiet, a thoughtful, introspective stillness. "What ghost do you carry, Clara?" he asked, his voice still rough but clear. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it cracked open a part of her she had kept walled off even from herself. She had tended his wounds, physical and spiritual, and now he was asking to see hers. She hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The secret she held was a stone in her gut, a shame so heavy she had never given it voice. But in the quiet trust of this moment, with this man who had seen the very worst of her fear and the very best of her strength, the words began to surface. "A long time ago," she began, her voice a near whisper. "Before my mother passed, before my father's heart turned to stone, there was a boy. He worked on a neighboring ranch. He had kind eyes and a slow smile." She paused, the memory a bittersweet ache. "We were young. We didn't understand the consequences. I found myself with child." She risked a glance at him. His face was impassive, his attention completely on her. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, waiting stillness. "My father found out," she continued, the words coming faster now, a torrent of long-buried pain. "He handled it," he said, like he would handle a sick calf or a broken fence. "He locked me in my room for months. He told everyone I was ill with a fever." Her breath hitched. "When my time came, there was a woman. I never saw her face clearly. They took him from me the moment he was born. A boy. They told me he was sent to a good family, a family that could give him a name. I never even got to hold him." The shame and grief she had carried for years poured out of her. The burning humiliation, the aching emptiness in her arms, the guilt that she, a girl of 16, had not been strong enough to fight her father and the whole world for her own son. She buried her face in her knees, her shoulders shaking with the silent sobs she had swallowed for a lifetime. She felt a hand, his good hand, on her back, a warm, solid weight. He did not say the empty words she might have expected. He did not tell her it wasn't her fault or that it would be all right. He waited until the storm of her weeping had subsided into shuddering breaths. Then he spoke, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of grief. "They don't get to decide what you are," he said. "They took a child from you. They didn't take you. You are more than what they took from you. Clara." His words were a revelation. He did not see her as soiled or broken. He saw her as a survivor, a person separate from the terrible things that had been done to her. She lifted her head, her face wet with tears, and looked at him. The profound, unconditional acceptance in his eyes was a balm on a wound she had thought would never heal. A new feeling began to stir in her, a feeling that had nothing to do with shame or grief. It was a fierce, insistent pulse of life. She had survived. She had fought. She had cared for this man and brought him back from the brink of death. She was not a victim. She was here. She was alive. She moved closer to him, her knee brushing against his. "I want you to touch me again," she whispered, her voice husky but unwavering. He drew back slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Clara!" "No," she said, her gaze holding his. "Not out of pity. Not because I'm broken. Because I'm not. I want to feel something other than fear or sorrow. I want to remember what feeling alive means." It was not a plea. It was a demand. It was her choice, her desire, spoken freely and without shame for the first time in her life. Understanding dawned on his face, replacing the uncertainty with a deep, smoldering tenderness. He leaned in, and this time, it was his lips that sought hers, not in a desperate collision, but with a slow, deliberate reverence. He led her back into the shadows of the cave, to their bed of pine boughs. What happened between them was not a desperate act of survival, but a slow, unhurried exploration. It was gentle and it was fierce. A silent conversation between two scarred and broken people who had found a place of healing in each other's arms. His touch was not that of a man taking, but of a man worshiping. He traced the lines of her body as if he were memorizing a sacred text, and she, in turn, met his fierce passion with her own. No longer a frightened girl, but a woman claiming her own pleasure, her own body. When their bodies trembled together in the darkness, it was not with fear or with pain, but with a profound and shuddering release, a letting go of all the ghosts, all the grief, all the poisons of the past. The next day, as they rode, the world seemed new, its colors sharper, the air cleaner. They were no longer just two people running together. They were a unit, a partnership forged in violence and sealed in a hard-won intimacy. Late in the afternoon, they saw a lone figure on the trail ahead, a man in a dusty black coat leading a mule. As they drew closer, they saw he was a traveling preacher, his Bible worn and his face etched with the loneliness of the road. An idea, sudden and powerful, took hold of Clara. She turned to James. "Wait," she said. She approached the preacher, who regarded them with wary but not unkind eyes. "We're not looking to be married, preacher," she said, before he could ask. James stood beside her, his expression questioning but trusting. "We're looking to be born. We need new names. Can you write them down? In a ledger. Something to make it real." The preacher, a man who had seen all manner of strange things on the frontier, simply nodded slowly. He dismounted and pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from his saddlebag. He opened it to a fresh page, uncorked a small bottle of ink, and dipped his pen. "What names will you take in the eyes of God in this wilderness?" Clara looked at James, a question in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, deferring to her. She thought for a moment, not of fancy names, but of simple, strong ones, names that could disappear into a crowd, names without a past. "Sarah," she said, "and Jacob." The preacher wrote them down, the scratch of his pen the only sound. Sarah and Jacob began their journey. October 1888. He did not ask for their old names. He blew on the ink until it was dry and closed the book. "Go with God," he said, and continued on his way. It was not a wedding. There were no vows, no rings, but as they rode away, Clara felt a lightness she had never known. She was no longer Clara Abernathy, the runaway bride. She was Sarah, a woman heading west with her partner, Jacob. It was a start. That night, they made camp in a small, defensible box canyon. A sense of hope, fragile but real, had settled over them. They believed they had outrun the past. They were wrong. They were sitting by the fire, sharing a piece of jerky, when the first sound came, the soft clatter of a dislodged stone from the canyon rim above. James was on his feet in an instant, rifle in his hand, but it was too late. Figures emerged from the darkness on all sides, the glint of rifle barrels catching the firelight. "Don't even think about it. Outlaw!" a familiar, sneering voice said. Sheriff Miller stepped into the light, his pistol aimed squarely at James's chest. He was flanked by 3 of Edwin's hired men. And then Edwin Voss himself stepped out from behind a rock. He was dressed in a fine traveling coat, his face composed in a mask of cold, triumphant satisfaction. His eyes were fixed on Clara, and they held the dead, possessive gleam of a collector who has just recovered a prized possession. There was no fight. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. One of the men wrenched the rifle from James's grasp. Another slammed the butt of his own rifle into James's gut, doubling him over. They dragged him to a lone, skeletal pine tree at the center of the canyon and began to tie his hands behind it, pulling the ropes cruelly tight. Sheriff Miller advanced on Clara. He held up a pair of iron shackles. "Mr. Voss wants to make sure you don't go for another ride. Girl," he said with a greasy smile. The cold, heavy iron closed around her wrists. The sound of the lock clicking shut a final, damning sentence. Edwin walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze raking over her worn clothes, her tanned skin, her calloused hands. "Did you really think a little dirt and a stray dog could change what you are?" he said, his voice a low, calm murmur that was more terrifying than any shout. "You are a line in a ledger. My ledger, an asset I acquired from your father." He turned to look at James, who was struggling against his bonds, his face a mask of helpless fury. "And him," Edwin said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He is just a complication to be removed." He pulled a double-barreled shotgun from the hands of one of his men. He walked over to Clara, the sheriff dragging her to meet him. He pressed the cold, twin muzzles of the shotgun against her chest, right over her heart. He looked back at James, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You were always going to be mine," he said, his words meant for both of them. "I paid for you." A sound, a low, guttural roar of pure, animalistic rage, was torn from James's throat. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he threw his entire body against the ropes. There was a sharp crack as a dead branch on the old pine gave way. Giving him just enough slack, he twisted, his wrists raw and bleeding, and one hand came free. He lunged for the nearest of Edwin's men, the one who had taken his pistol. The camp exploded into chaos. James slammed the man against a rock, grabbed his own pistol, and turned. Sheriff Miller, his face a mask of shock, raised his own weapon, but James was faster. A single shot cracked through the night, and the sheriff crumpled to the ground, a neat hole in his forehead. Edwin, his face contorted in a snarl of fury, turned the shotgun from Clara and fired both barrels at James. The force of the blast threw James backward as if he'd been hit by a hammer. He landed in a heap, 2 dark, spreading stains on his chest. For a single, frozen second, everything was silent. Edwin, his shotgun now empty, dropped it and began to walk toward James's body, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. But in that second, Clara moved. She lunged for the discarded shotgun, her shackled hands making the movement clumsy. One of the remaining hired men started toward her, but his nerve broke. He looked at the dead sheriff, at James's body, and at the look of pure, cold murder in Edwin's eyes. He turned and fled into the darkness, his partner right behind him. Clara scooped up the shotgun. It was heavy, unwieldy. She fumbled with the breech, her fingers finding the shells James had taught her to carry in her pocket. She broke the gun open, ejected the spent cartridges, and rammed 2 new ones home. It was an eternity, a lifetime, but it took only seconds. She snapped the gun shut and raised it. Edwin had just reached James's body. He turned, his face a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Put that down, you stupid girl!" he snarled. Her hands were steady. She looked down the long, dark barrels, past the sight, and into the eyes of the man who had tried to own her soul. She did not say a word. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the gun was a physical blow, the kick slamming the stock back into her shoulder. Edwin was lifted off his feet and thrown backward, a ragged, bloody hole erupting in the center of his chest. He landed hard, the air driven from his lungs in a wet gasp. Silence descended on the small canyon, a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged sound of Clara's own breathing. Edwin was not dead. He was on his back, his fine coat ruined, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and disbelief. And then he began to move. He began to crawl. His fingers clawed at the dirt, dragging his shattered body forward, 1 painful inch at a time. He was crawling toward her. Even in death, his last instinct was to possess, to claim. Clara stood over him, the shotgun held loosely at her side. She watched him for a long, cold moment. Then, without a word, without a glance back at the dying creature on the ground, she turned and walked toward the still, broken form of the only man who had ever seen her as a person. She walked away, silent. The silence in the canyon was a ringing, deafening thing. The fire crackled, indifferent. Edwin's last, rattling breath had long since faded into the vast, cold emptiness of the night. Clara knelt in the dirt beside James, her hands, still shackled, hovering over the terrible, dark wounds in his chest. The shotgun blast had torn through him, a brutal, close-range assault. He was breathing, but each breath was a shallow, wet rattle, a sound that spoke of punctured lungs and internal bleeding. He was dying. She looked at the key ring on the dead sheriff's belt. Her mind, which should have been screaming, was a place of preternatural calm, a cold, clear engine of survival. She fumbled with the keys, her shackled hands making the task a clumsy nightmare. Finally, a key turned. The heavy iron fell away from her wrists, leaving raw, bruised circles on her skin. She had to move him. To leave him here was to let him die. But where? The nearest town was Jasper's Fork, a 2-day ride for a healthy man. He would never make it. Then she remembered the prospector's words, a passing mention of an old woman who lived on the edge of the dark timber, a healer who kept to herself and traded in herbs and old-world knowledge. It was a fool's hope, a whisper in the wind. But it was all she had. Getting him onto his horse was an act of desperate, brutal strength. He was a dead weight, barely conscious, groaning with every movement. She heaved and pushed, her muscles screaming, tears of exertion and terror streaming down her face. She tied him to the saddle. His body slumped forward over the horse's neck. She took the remaining horse, the bounty hunter's bay, and loaded it with what little she could salvage, a canteen of water, the rifle, and a single blanket. She did not look back at the bodies. They were part of a world that had burned down behind her. The journey was a waking nightmare. She walked, leading the horses, for she did not dare ride and risk moving faster than a crawl. She moved through the darkness, guided by the stars. Her entire being focused on the ragged sound of James's breathing. Every groan from him was a knife in her gut. Every stumble of the horse was a jolt of pure panic. She pushed on, driven by a will that was no longer her own, a force born of a love so fierce and new it felt like it would tear her apart. She found the place at dawn of the second day, a small, turf-roofed hut tucked into a fold of the hills where the high plains met the deep forest. A thin tendril of smoke rose from a stone chimney. An old woman sat on a stool by the door, grinding something in a stone bowl. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her skin the color of tanned leather, and her dark eyes, when they lifted to meet Clara's, were ancient and held no surprise. "He is hurt bad," the woman said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was a statement, not a question. Clara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The woman helped her get James inside, her movements surprisingly strong. She laid him on a pallet of furs. She examined the wounds with a practiced, gentle touch, her lips pursed in a grim line. "The pellets are deep," she said. "Some have passed through, some have not. The fever will be the thing. If he lives past the fever, he may live." She looked at Clara, her gaze sharp and assessing. "My work is not free." Clara had nothing. No money, no prospects. She had only what she had arrived with. She walked back outside without a word. She took the rifle from its scabbard and laid it on the ground. She unsaddled both horses and laid the saddles beside it. She took the blanket, the canteen, the last of the jerky from the saddlebags. She offered up everything she had in the world, her ability to hunt, to travel, to defend herself, her entire future. The old woman came out and looked at the pile of goods. She looked at the two fine horses. She looked at Clara's face, at the desperation and the unyielding resolve etched there. She nodded once. "It is enough," she said. "Go, sit with him." For days the world was the dim, herb-scented light of the hut. James did not wake. He drifted in a deep, fevered sea, his body burning with infection as the healer worked her quiet magic. She brewed foul-smelling teas that she forced between his lips. She made poultices of moss and chewed roots that she placed on his wounds. She spoke to him in a low, crooning language Clara did not understand, as if calling his spirit back from a great distance. Clara kept vigil. She did not sleep, except in short, exhausted snatches, sitting on the floor by his side, in the long, silent hours. She did nothing but remember. She remembered the first time she saw him, his stillness, the hawk-like intensity of his eyes. She remembered his gruff, reluctant kindness, the way he had tended her feet and offered her food without a word. She replayed his pained confession about Eleanor, the terrible weight of the past he carried. She felt again the shock of his hand on her wrist in the mine shack, the desperate, hungry kiss in the storm. She remembered his patience as he taught her to shoot, the quiet pride in his eyes when she hit her mark. She saw the raw agony on his face when he was shot, and the fierce, protective rage that had risen in her in response. She remembered it all, every glance, every silence, every touch. He had taken a broken, terrified girl and shown her how to be a woman. He had given her a life, and she would not let him lose his own. On the 5th day, the fever began to recede. The healer nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in her ancient eyes. "He is strong," she said. "His spirit fights." On the morning of the 6th day, Clara was wiping his face with a cool, damp cloth when his eyelids fluttered. She held her breath. His eyes opened. They were cloudy at first, unfocused. Then they found her, and a flicker of recognition, of clarity, returned to them. He was here. He was back. A sound, a ragged, choked sob, broke from her lips. The strength that had held her together for a week, the iron will that had driven her through the wilderness and sustained her through the long vigil. It all dissolved in an instant. The tears she had refused to shed came in a great, shuddering wave. She collapsed beside him, her head on his good shoulder, and wept. her body shaking with a week's worth of terror and grief and desperate hope. "Don't you leave me!" she sobbed into his shirt, her voice thick and raw. "Don't you dare!" His hand, weak but steady, came up and rested in her hair. He said nothing. He just held her, his touch a silent promise. News from the world of men travels slowly in the high country, but it travels. A trapper, passing through, brought the first stories. The tale of the shootout at the Box Canyon had spread, colored with rumor and exaggeration, but the core of it was true. Edwin Voss, the wealthy landowner, was dead. So was Sheriff Miller. Then, a few weeks later, the traveling preacher came through, his face grim. He had been in Redemption Gulch when the full story broke. The two hired men who had fled had talked, eager to save their own skins. They told of Voss's cold-blooded cruelty, of his plan to murder James and reclaim his property. The preacher himself had testified, telling the circuit judge about the two people who called themselves Sarah and Jacob, who had asked not for a wedding but for a new beginning. The town, which had lived in the shadow of Edwin's power for so long, turned on his memory. Stories that had only been whispers before were now spoken aloud, tales of his cruelty, of the suspicious deaths of his first two wives, of his corrupt dealings. The old midwife, Martha, told her story of the frightened girl with the eyes of a cornered doe. The lie of the kidnapping was exposed, and the truth of Clara's flight, of her desperate bid for freedom, became a local legend. A lawyer, representing the interests of the town and the distant relatives of Edwin's previous wives, eventually found his way to the healer's hut. He was a kind-faced man who looked out of place in the wilderness. He explained that Edwin's estate had been broken up, his assets seized, as a recognized victim of his abuses. Clara was entitled to a substantial compensation. He handed her a bank draft for an amount of money that made her head spin. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a fine house, new clothes, a life of ease. That night, after the lawyer had gone, Clara sat by the fire outside the hut. James, now able to sit up on his own, was beside her. She held the bank draft in her hand, looking at the elegant script, the official seals. It was the price of her suffering. It was blood money. She looked at James, at his scarred, healing body, at the quiet strength in his face. She thought of the woman and her child who had died in the fire. She thought of the child she had lost, a transaction her father had made. Her whole life had been a series of transactions, of being bought and sold. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and held the corner of the paper to the fire. It caught, the flame greedily consuming the numbers, the signatures. She held it until the heat licked at her fingertips, then dropped the last burning scrap into the embers. "I'll never take what was bought with my soul," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. They stayed with the healer until James was strong enough to walk. When the day came to leave, they had nothing. They were on foot, with only the clothes on their backs and a small pouch of dried herbs the healer had given them. But they were free. They walked away from the hut, hand in hand, turning their faces west, toward the setting sun. They did not go to Colorado. They found their place in a quiet valley, 100 miles from any town, a place where a wide, clear river cut through a grove of cottonwood trees. And they began to build. They felled trees and hewed logs, their movements falling into an easy, companionable rhythm. They built a home. It was not a fine house. It was a small, rough cabin of one room, with a stone hearth and a sturdy roof. It was simple, quiet, and as scarred and resilient as they were. They lived by the rhythms of the seasons. They planted a garden. He hunted and fished. She learned the names of the wild plants, which were for medicine and which for food. They spoke little, for they had no need of words. They understood each other in the quiet language of shared glances, of hands that found each other in the darkness. The ghosts of their pasts were still there. Eleanor, the lost child, the men they had killed, but they were quiet now, relegated to the shadows. their power to wound diminished by the simple, solid reality of the life they had built together. One night, they lay on their pallet by the dying embers of the fire. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the river and the sigh of the wind in the cottonwoods. She lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, his arm a warm, solid weight around her. The scars on his chest were a familiar landscape beneath her fingers. She was no longer running. She was no longer afraid. She was home. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear, her whispered words a final, quiet testament to the long, hard road that had brought her here. "I've never felt so alive." From a distance, under the vast, star-dusted blanket of the western sky, the cabin was just a small, warm pinprick of light in the great, dark wilderness. Inside, by the fire, were two silhouettes, two survivors, scarred and whole, their long run finally over. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.